Brothers, I hope this session will be the most enjoyable of all. You can see it's only a one-pager, but don't let one page of notes deceive you. They can be longer. And we have an hour and a half allotted for this particular session. We're going to get into this is the one on the model sermon outlines. Just find that in your notes. We'll be there. We're going to spend some time there. And I want to tell you that it's one thing to have your material ready. It sure is another thing to deliver it. So we're going to now look at this part, the delivery part, assuming that you get the thing together and everything is good and strong and well planned, but you don't always do what you plan to do. Sometimes things come along and can change that. Remember, the people in the audience will not know what you're doing in your studio, in your study. I mean, they can figure it out if you haven't been doing your job. But they can see what you're doing in that pulpit. I mean, they're looking at you. They can tell if you're not looking good, or if you're sweating, or they can tell if you're on beam or not. So this is the part. The delivery part is so important. But of course, it's strengthened and it's made easier if you're well prepared. So I stress the preparing part. But let's now look at a model, what I call a model sermon outline. A lot of information on here. You saw some percentages a while ago as we were about to have lunch. And as Brother Lonnie added them up, it ends up to 400% or some big number. But you have to integrate that. So we're now going to look at those in terms of real minutes. And just notice that we look at the title of the sermon. The title of the sermon. I've already indicated that the title should be a good indicator of what is in the sermon. It should tell. You read the title, you know this is kind of what it's about. It won't be obviously very long and in detail, but it suggests where you're headed in the sermon. Really, everything in the sermon, from the title on to the conclusion, should all be about that message from God that you're trying to convey. So everything is pointing to like a vanishing point in a beautiful picture, or main bullseye in an arrow, in a target. I read sermons sometimes, and I have to tell you, when I read them, I can't figure out what they're talking about. I mean, it doesn't suggest what's coming. And maybe every now and then there's an occasion for a surprise, but generally, the intent of a sermon is not for surprise. It's not in that. It's to do the best job you can to get this message across to that people. Everything in the sermon pointing to the getting of the message across, including that title. Now, I put text under here. The common way when you're preparing an outline or a manuscript is put the text under there. I have, for probably several years, maybe 7 or 8, have pretty well quit putting the text as its own separate line. I put the text in the introduction part. I mean, it's integrated down there when I get to it. One of the reasons for that, for me, just personally, if you will turn the page, and we'll come back to the sermon outline idea, but if you will look to the next page in your notes, it's God's plan for good preaching. That's really a sermon that I preached myself. I just made that up, did the work on this and have this sermon. And you will see that it's on an 8.5 by 5.5 sheet for me. Now, you have a bigger book there, 8.5 by 11, but I have an 8.5 by 5.5. And this happens on 8.5 by 5.5 with the size font that I used, which I usually use a 10-point font for the title and the main points. And then I use a 8-point font for the compliance down here. And so that helps me. And one of the reasons I do this is a personal effort on my part to keep to the time frame. Most sermons are going to be around 35 minutes, plus or minus 5 minutes, maybe 10 at the max. There are not many preachers that can preach more than 45 minutes and keep an audience. Just a fact. There are a few that can captivate you. And what you all know is that a longer sermon that is done well and has substance seems much shorter than a short sermon that's done poorly with very little substance. I've seen people that are still hanging on after 45, 50 minutes. But I've seen people turned off after 5 or 10. I mean, they're ready. It's done. I mean, it's over. He ought to quit. They're just waiting him out. So you're looking at a picture of, again, having something to say and trying to say it well and do it within a given time frame. And you have to just realize up front that you're going to have about 35 minutes. People are going to give you their life. And it is their life. It's time. It's their giving you their life, that much of their life. And in return for their attention, they deserve to hear from God. They deserve for you to have something to say. And in terms of timing, just figure that at church you start at 11:30, or 11 o'clock. Then there's different times. But time will normally involve about an hour for the morning service, maybe an hour and a little bit more. So let's just assume it's 11 till 12. That's pretty standard still. Well, if you figure 25 minutes of music, and then you figure you're going to get in that pulpit about 11:25, maybe 11:30. If you get in at 11:25, you got 35 minutes to 12 o'clock. And I can't say what it is about 12 o'clock, but there's still something magic about it. I mean, people turn some off a knob in their head at 12 o'clock. Not everybody, but most people figure you're supposed to be through or getting real close to being through at 12 o'clock. So you just look at you got 35, and then you got a 10-minute invitation maybe. So it's 12:10, 12:15, and you're out. And people will, to some degree, tolerate that, but you start going to 12:30-ish and 12:45-ish. In most churches that I've been around, they don't like it. Just don't like it. So 35 minutes. So you got 35-minute sermon. I put my notes not in manuscript form. They're here in outline form. It just works for me better. I'm not opposed to manuscript. I'm not saying it's a holy grail, nor are notes a holy grail. Some fit better. I personally, I do not like to see a guy or hear a guy get up and read his notes. It's just drier. And there are a few who are good at it, but not very many who are good at reading their notes. Even though they have good substance, when they just read it, it doesn't have, it's not like it's coming from the heart. It's like it's coming off a sheet of paper. And most people are touched more, remember, by the heart. Hearts reach hearts. When you speak from your heart, it touches people in their hearts in much easier. I have no more. I won't say never, I can't remember in the last probably 10 or 15 years when I've gone to the pulpit with any more than an 8.5 by 5.5 sheet front and back. Sometimes I got a lot of scriptures. I may have them printed out on a separate sheet, so when I get to those scriptures, I can just read them. I don't turn to them every time. Because the sermon is going to be really, the cadence, the flow of it is impacted when you have to stop and turn to a passage in the Bible. Especially if it takes very long. And there's a lot of flipping of pages, and then you do that several times. It just breaks the flow, the smoothness of the sermon. So if I'm going to have several passages and I don't have time to write them into my notes, or enough, not time, but enough room on that sheet to write them into my notes, I'll just print them out on a separate sheet, and it's lying there on a pulpit or on the back, in the back of my Bible. And when I get to there, I can tell them and then read it. And they're catching up with me, And sometimes I don't have them turn to them. I only have them turn to the passages that are longer. If I'm just going to quote one verse or two, I'll be through with that and to another verse before they can find that verse in most cases. And a good thing by having a PowerPoint like you have here, they can see those scriptures up there. I don't always spell them out. I just put the reference sometimes. But they at least have the reference. And one of the things we do where I am, I give my sermon notes, my preaching notes, to the secretary at the beginning. I give her a month ahead these notes. And I have her make a little outline for the bulletin. And she'll put a few blanks in there where people fill in the blanks. But I have her put those scriptures, the ones especially that I'm going to read, right there in the Sunday bulletin. And they got a handout, everybody does, and they can go along with the sermon and write in the blanks and turn to those scriptures, or at least they have captured them if they want to do them at home. Because when I preach, I know that I have 35 minutes, maybe 40. So I don't want to waste any of my time. I don't have enough time to waste. I need to be preaching and explaining, and there's a flow when they get into it that anything can break that momentum, that flow. There is a reality to momentum. That's the reason that when a guy's about to try to kick a field goal for a Major League Football team, the other coach will oftentimes call timeout. He knows that to break in the cadence somehow messes the mentality up. And to think, well, I think in a preaching, it's the very same. And if you got too many things where people have to stop and do something else, like turn to a passage, and I think it is good that people turn to some, but I think it's better that they do it when it's easy to do and it's flow. It's not just a constant moving and having to concentrate on something. They really need to be listening to you preach, what they need to be doing, and then hearing it and knowing with confidence that what you're saying is really in the Bible, because you can check it out. It's right there on your notes. It's on the screen in front of you. And sometimes I'll leave it on the screen, if there's 2 or 3 verses, maybe and spell them out up there. But I put front and back. Like I said, I can't imagine in the last probably 10 or 15 years when I've had a sermon that was not front and back, one 8.5 by 11 sheet, or 8.5 by 5.5 sheet. And this is just right. It fits in my preaching Bible, right into my back of my preaching Bible. And it's not obtrusive. It's not a big old thing like I'm going with a book or I'm going with the iPad or something. I'm not against that. I'm just saying that it's there. I go up with my Bible. I got my notes right here. And by preaching, by having all my notes on the front and back, it limits me. I can put nearly everything I need to say there. If I keep going on another page or two, I'm going to have a hard time getting into 35 minutes. It's something subliminal in my thinking, at least for me, to keep me, keeps me on track. So it's a personally imposed limitation to me to put all my notes right here, because I know by then I've said enough. And it's usually taken all the time to say enough. So I'm not reading my notes, because some people ask, well, how do you do that? It's too little. I'm not reading my notes. I know what's in my notes. I wrote these notes. I've prayed about them. I thought about them. And I'm not this brightest guy, but I can, I kind of have an idea. And when I look at my notes, and there's my main point 1 and my second point and 3, it's a reminder to me. And I'm back on track again, because I'm old enough now to have a few senior moments when I can't even remember my kids' names hardly. Just all of a sudden, just draw these blank spots. But I look down here, and there I am, back on track again, because all I need is just to see the first word usually, and it reminds me, and I'm right on track again, and I can preach with freedom from my heart, not just off a sheet of paper. And that affects people. And I just found it works for me that I put my title, my sermon title, in black, in bold, in caps. And then I put my main points, my compliance here, in Roman numeral, usually have 3. And I put those all in bold and black. And then I put my A, B's, and C's here. I put those in black and bold, but not all caps. It gives me a little difference in the break, and I know I'm making a supporting idea point here. And then I put all of my scriptures in red. It just works out good. When I look down and I see red on my notes, I know I'm time for me to quote or read that passage. And I put my scripture references in bold when I'm going to read them, and I put an asterisk right in front of it. So when I see an asterisk and it's in bold, I know that I'm usually going to read that passage. And so it keeps me from having to fish around and struggle in the middle of the sermon, because you don't want to be struggling there. That's when you want to just share your heart and what's on your heart. So you look at that outline and you can see I'm talking about here a title, a text, and an introduction. Then I'm getting into the first major idea, or point, second and third, and then the subpoints, and into the conclusion. So in the sermon, you can see by the model sermon outline that you're looking at those major, basically the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Three main points or aspects of the sermon. And in the body, which is going to be the biggest, you're going to have the body subdivided with your outline, which you get the outline out of the scripture. That's where it came from. You didn't have to make it up. But if you get an outline if you bite off too much, too big of a section, and it's going to involve an outline with 4 points or 5 points, you're going to have a devil of a time getting it preached in 35 minutes. And remember, that's sort of your boss. You can go over every now and then, but I'll tell you, you can't go over consistently. Otherwise, you get branded, and then people begin to see. So those are the points in the sermon. Introduction, first major point, second major point, third major, and then a conclusion. You may have 4, you may have 2 major points. That'll vary depending on the text. But that's what you're looking at and aiming at. Now, as I said in the introduction, I have my text embedded. I don't have it all read. I mean, I don't print it all out and have it in red so I can read it off my scripture. Off my notes. But I put the text itself up there, reference. And then I'll read it. That's the one time that I have everybody looking with me, almost always, to read the text together, so that everybody gets to see it. But I want them to see what I'm going to do. I'm telling them what I'm going to say, and I'm going to show them out of this passage. I read the passage, so they're looking at the passage, and as I do what I said I was going to do, yeah, I see that. So that's the anchor point, the text reference itself. And again, just to save space, I don't have enough room for it, but it's a separate line usually, so I just embedded it down in my introduction. Now let me talk about the introduction here, because this is so important. It's kind of like a runner you see at the Olympics. Sometimes those 100-yard dash people, they're all lined up at those steps there where they're going to run. And somebody will falter at the front and maybe stumble a little bit. It is hard to recover and win the race when you stumble at the front. If you stumble out of the chute, so to speak, right here at the very beginning in your introduction, chances are it'll be hard in the sermon to recover. It's just you're off balance right off the front. And it's a little embarrassing, I think, for all of us to mess up right off the front end. Well, the introduction is so important. And look at it, 3 to 5 minutes. Hold that point, go down there to first major idea or point. Premise number 1, 7 to 10 minutes. Second one, 7 to 10. Third one, 7 to 10. Conclusion, 3 to 5. Okay, we have our resident mathematician here. Lonnie, how many is that? He's put him on the spot. Well, you figure if you go 3, let's just suppose you have 3 in your introduction and you have 3 in your conclusion. Chances are it's going to be more like 3.5 between the two, maybe even 4 or 5. But let's just suppose you have 3.5 minutes conclusion, and introduction together. That's 7 minutes. All right? Now you have, let's say, 7 minutes on an average in 3 points. 3 to 7 is 21. 21, what are we looking at? About 29 minutes. You're right at 30 minutes. Most people will thank you if you give them back a minute. They won't complain if you got it completed, if you've done the job in 30 minutes. Let's suppose you take 8 minutes per point. 3 to 8 is 24, and 8 is what? 32? Your sermon's done. I mean, it don't take much off balance here to get you out of balance in your whole sermon. And you have to think about this, and you won't always succeed, but you have to try at it. Very seldom does a blind hog find an acorn. Every now and then, but not real often. So you think about what's going to happen in your introduction. Your introduction needs to point to the sermon, because this is not a time for jokes. It's not a time, well, I'm so glad to be here. You may have to say a little of that here and there, but it's a time to preach. And I've seen so many preachers gobble up 2 or 3 or 4 minutes of valuable time hot dogging to the audience. I didn't come here to see a clown. Didn't come here to hear a comedian. I came here to hear from God. That's why people ought to go to church. Not all of them do, but that's why they ought to go to church, to hear from the Lord, to worship Him in His house. I won't get into this. It's another thing. I got a real pet peeve about what I call commercials in church. We've got this holy grail of we've got to start the church. We've got to have one song. We got to have announcements, or maybe a song and a prayer and announcement. But then we go on down the line, and in most churches you could go in there 2 or 3 times, and the next time you could shut your eyes and know what's next. It's just routine. There needs to be some freshness and breaking up the order. Maybe sing 2 songs in a special instead of thump, thump, thump. But in that mix is almost always announcements. It's almost like we go to church, we worship God by preaching, praying, singing, giving, and Lord's Supper and announcements. It's like it's one, hello, I don't believe I saw announcements somewhere in the Bible. Well, we got to tell them about the cookie sale, or about the fellowship after church, or about the da-da-da-da. And there's always a lot. In fact, I've seen it to where people at Berean would have announcements packed on the pulpit when I got up there. Would you talk about our Sunday school class? Would you? I said, no, I'm not going to talk about your Sunday school class. I'm going to preach, and we're going to come. We didn't come here to do commercials. We came here to worship God, and we're going to do that. And we'll do something at the end of the service maybe, or before. In fact, I tell them, if you want the announcements, they're in the Sunday bulletin. And I use that time, if there's an announcement time when I welcome everybody, to maybe say something, hey, this deacon died this week, and he's going to have his funeral Tuesday, and I'll just kind of incorporate that in, because you can get everything like that in the announcement, in the bulletin. But the bulletin can save your neck. I mean, it can help you with getting the stuff so you don't have to use pulpit time and worship time to do all of this kind of stuff. But after all, if you get your attention on the Lord, and then you go to the announcements, it's almost like you come off of this high and lofty presence with the Lord, and now we're going to talk about all this nitty-gritty down here. Now we're going to get back up here. Why not just get people in the church to see God and stay with their attention on Him to the end? They want to see something else, they can go to the bulletin, or they can wait around after church, and you can say a few things if you need to. But anyway, I'm just talking about that announcements and what preachers do in introductions has something in common. It breaks the whole train of what we came to do. We came here to preach. So preach. And yes, I'm glad to be here, and all that, especially like coming up here. I've been up here to Midway in a meeting or two, and I would say, well, I'm glad to be here and so on. But I try not to spend more than about a minute, maybe even less than a minute, to doing that stuff, because I know that I'm here to represent the Lord. Remember, I'm His spokesman, and I'm preaching His message. So in this introduction part, it should be everything about the sermon. Everything about the sermon. It needs to get attention. First of all, What you going to do, preacher? We're giving you 35 minutes of our life. What you going to do with it? What you going to talk about? And whatever you say needs to be said well enough or in some way that they see, they want to see it. They're interested. It's interesting. They hear you. Then at number 2, it needs to establish the theme and the direction of the sermon. Not just an attention getter, but to focus the attention on the theme. Where's the theme come from? It's a central idea of the text. It comes right out of the scriptures. This is where you're trying to get people from the very get-go. The very first words that are out of your mouth should be to put their attention where it ought to be, and what you're going to try to do here in these next 30 or 35 minutes. And then announce what you're about to do or to accomplish. That is, you state this proposition. I want to show you 3 things, personal truths from Psalm 23 about the love of God or about God himself or whatever your theme it is. And then that's a good place. I'll say sometimes here when I'm talking about the theme and the direction of the sermon, today, in a moment, I'll be in Psalm 23, verse 1. But while you're looking at that, I want to tell you, and then I'll do a little more introduction and getting attention. But you need to get attention and establish your theme and where you're going, and then kind of give what you're going to unwrap, the expository aspect. I'm going to expose, I'm going to show you from the Bible these 3 truths or these 3 calamities or whatever, and then your text. Read your text. And you can't generally read a whole chapter. You need to, sometimes I'm maybe dealing with 2 verses or 3 verses, and that's where it's easy enough to read. But what if your text is scattered out into 20 verses? What I do sometimes is just summarize. I'll highlight it. The main idea is here in verse 3, and I'm going to skip down to verse 10, but I try to give them the idea without reading the whole text. And I don't think you call this cheating, but it's just doing something. We have, and I think churches need to have periodically, not necessarily every service, public Bible reading. In the early churches, it was common. Nearly every time they got together, they read from the scriptures. Paul the Apostle talked about a letter to be, his letters to be passed around to the churches, to be read in the churches. So, you got wonderful biblical precedent and historical precedent for reading the Bible. I'll have somebody else, someone that I know someone is a good reader, earlier in the service, just before, for example, the last hymn or before the last special, right maybe before the tithes and offerings. Have him up, he'll read maybe 7 verses or 8, the whole text. And then he'll pray and we'll have the offering and we go. But I've gotten the Bible. The text is read. The whole thing's read. I didn't have to take time out of my sermon to read it, but it's already in front of the people. They're already thinking about it because he's read it. And I tell, I direct which one, how much to read. I usually select the Bible of public readings, but it's good to just let them read your text on that time when you're going to preach from it. Save a little time there. I'm thinking of time. So I've got about an hour to do the whole thing, all the songs and everything, and then get out of there, and the sermon's got to be about 35 minutes. So 3 to 5 minutes is about what you got, and you can't cheat much on either one of these, otherwise you're going to be into 40 or 45 minutes, and if you're not careful, you'll be into 50 minutes. And so this is so critical. And this is just a delivery. This is assuming you've got a good message. But even if you've got a good message already prepared, you can mess it up in delivery. Anybody y'all ever seen one messed up? I've messed up a few. That's not the right word, probably. Probably many, more than a few. So here, in this introduction, is designed to get you going, immediately get started preaching. It can be light, it can be fun, it can be heavy, it can be whatever. It should, though, get attention, and it should establish the theme and the direction, and it should announce what you intend to do. Those 3 things have to happen or should happen in this text or in this introduction. Now, I'll just give you just a for example. I was preaching the Holt's Prairie Baptist Church had their 145th birthday and a celebration built around that a week ago this past weekend. And Brother Hirsch had asked me to come up there really at the Rogers Missions Conference a year ago. And so I went up there and was speaking on Friday night, to the whole church. And I have a sermon that I enjoy preaching. It's a trip down to the potter's house from Jeremiah 18. And its sermon is about the potter doing what nobody thinks. Verse 4 is where the real crux of the sermon is. It's a natural outline there. And he says, and the clay was marred in the hands of the potter. So he made it again, another vessel. And that is just it's just right there. It's marred. Everybody is marred. The clay is a picture of people. And it was marred, and we were all there, marred, ruined. But the potter made it again. Praise God that he gives us second chances. He gives us a chance to get things straightened up and do right. And he can make our lives and reform us. And take an old somebody that's all messed up and fix their lives. Some of the best people that I've had to serve the Lord with in various capacities have been people who had divorces or people who had other breaks of one sort or another. But they humbled themselves and God was able to use them. And so, point 1, marred. Point 2, he made it again. Point 3, another vessel. A vessel better. Something that's good, more useful than it ever was before. It's the Humpty Dumpty story that only God can pull off. I mean, Humpty fell and broke, and God put him together. Nobody can do that. It's just a testimony to the grace of God, and there's a lot of scriptures in it. So, that's the sermon that I was preaching that particular night. And the way I started that sermon, I said, I'm going to tell you tonight about an old rooster and some hens over in East Texas around Center, who every morning the old rooster would get up and he would crow as if he was causing the sun to rise. They'd all cluck around a little and dig around the barnyard, eat all the worms they could find, and go off down the hill to a little old creek down there. And one day while they were down there, an ostrich came through and laid an ostrich egg right in the middle of the barnyard. Big old egg. Ostrich went on his way, and the old rooster and the hens came back, and the rooster saw that ostrich egg at a distance, and he began to cluck, and the hens gathered, and they were a little bit afraid, and finally got enough nerve and got and gathered all around that egg, and the old rooster's up there, and he can't figure it out, so he pecks on it a little, and finally jumps right up on top of that egg and says, now, ladies, gather around. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I am going to tell you what can be done. Well, I'm not a jokester. I'm not a storyteller like that. You say, well, why would you do that? Because I'm going to talk to them about what can be done. You see, the attention getter is designed to bring attention to what we're going to do. And we're going to talk about the help and the grace of God who can make you do more when he gets through with you than you could ever do by yourself. So everything in that introduction should point there. Every word. Then once you've told them what you're going to do in the introduction, 2 or 3 minutes, 4, you got to do it. So there's where you really get in saying, okay, you start whatever your first point is, depending on what your sermon is, whatever you've dug out of the scriptures you got to preach. So it's your first, as old Brother Clayton would say, this is my first big point. Here, remember, all of your big points are going to be related and parallel and connected and all going somewhere, not just walking along in a disjointed direction, but going somewhere. So the first major idea, let's just talk about this. It's the first idea or point. If you probably know what a syllogism is. A syllogistic reasoning is sort of in the field of logic. And it's a 3-point argument. It's a 2 premise based and then a conclusion that's drawn out of or based from the premises. And the reality mathematically about a syllogism is that if your premises are right, your conclusion will always be right. And a person that doesn't have a clue as to what a syllogism is or logic is, they they see it. I mean, it locked tight. When you make a couple of claims and then draw a conclusion, and if those claims are right, they're going to believe you. They're going to believe that what you said was right, especially when you can substantiate it right out of the Word of God. So it's logical arguing that you're doing here, and the Bible makes cases. It's always arguing like an attorney in a court of law. See that especially in Romans. The Bible's just making cases. And you're the messenger who's to take the cases and make them with that people here. So they didn't just believe it in Corinth, they believe it over here in McKinney and in Childress and wherever you are, godly. Even the godly people will believe that. Yes. So it's the first major point. And notice that it's got to be somewhere in a 7 to 10 minute bracket. If you're going to use 10 minutes on premise 1, what are you going to have to do at premise 2 or 3 and stay in 30? You're going to have to take 3 minutes off down here. That's not usually done. What the preacher says, well, I'm just so good, they'll listen to me anyway if I go over. And that's lying to yourself for the most part, isn't it? You don't do it that way. So anyway, we want to look at the premise, and we got a time frame here. And notice it should always be, every one of these major points or premises should be from the text, and they're always compliant with or in harmony with or supportive of the text. You have a theme, something you're going to develop. Well, here's how you start developing it. Here's how you start making the argument. And by the way, we preachers sometimes maybe we grieve a little bit about because we have 35 minutes and we, the little people ought to be willing to listen to the truth longer than that. Well, we get real holy. You know that when a case comes to the Supreme Court in the United States, Roe versus Wade, or any of these cases, you know that the attorney that presents the case is given 30 minutes by the court. It may go 35, may go 2 hours, but it'll only be when the Supreme Court judges keep him there and start asking questions. His time to present his case or make his case is 30 minutes. That ought to tell us something. In the real world around us, time is people's lives, and they give it to us, and we have to honor that. And therefore, we're going to make a case, and we got to start making it right off. We have 30 minutes to do it, or thereabouts. So, always from the text. That's how this is governed, whatever this text and subject. And then notice there are subpoints here, relates to and strengthens the first major point. In other words, everything between Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 should be about Roman numeral 1, making it a strong point, a believable point, substantiated. And here's where then, even under these subpoints, you have supporting evidence or supporting points. Like they strengthen. Everything under A is designed to strengthen A. Everything under B will strengthen B. Everything under C will strengthen C. And everything under A, B, and C strengthens number 1. It's building case, making it strong, making it believable. And while you're doing it, you have to make it enjoyable or interesting enough. Not necessarily enjoyable. When you're kicking shins, sometimes it's not so enjoyable. But when you're building a case, people need to be intrigued by it and interested in it. And if you get too dull and all that, he won't be interested. So what would make people interested? Good, fresh language, good gestures, good illustrations, support from authorities, some historical document that comes along that you could tell. Now, you can't use the same old illustrations you've used 50 times before in the last 2 years. They've heard them. They're tired of them. You have to be fresh. And that's hard because the older we get, the more we tend to be in our old world. And I can be talking about Minnie Pearl. Who on earth today ever heard of Minnie Pearl? Well, in my day, she was a chief Grand Ole Opry. Everybody knew she'd come in and say some funny words, like "hello, everybody," or "it's just Minnie Pearl." I mean, you can't use Minnie Pearl illustrations anymore. You'll have to explain who Minnie Pearl was, and they're going to say, "Well, why would I care?" you got to stay fresh. You need to keep reading the newspapers, or at least looking online and seeing what's going on in the world, and talk about real life and what's really happening, and stay fresh, because especially the young people will know whether you are on track or not. So this is Roman numeral 1. This is your first major point. What's it to do? It supports what you're preaching. It does what you said up here in that introduction you were going to do. And notice under number C, under 1C, transition. And there's one under number 2 at the very bottom before 3. And then there's no one at the end of number 3. This is a very rare commodity in lots of preaching. Many preachers do not use transitional thoughts to move from one point to another point, and so it becomes blurry. I see especially in young preachers that when they preach, I don't see much structure to their message. I don't see the outline. It's not clear. And so I don't know when they finish point 1 and got into point 2. It's not clear cut. Transitional thoughts help you to have your structure. You've made your first major idea. Now, I told you this is what I was going to say, and I said it. Now I want to tell you that in view of what I said, it means this, and then you go to your next point. But you've cased your point. You've gotten out of your introduction, and now you're into the body, and you've made the first big claim in the body that's to support the theme. And then you're going to say, okay, I'm going to another idea. It's not going to be different from the theme, but it's going to be a different area of thinking, an idea of proof that supports the theme. And the case gets stronger. And the case gets stronger. Yes. Building. Constantly building. And of course you do it the same way you did with the first major point. But it's not a repeat of the major first point, but it's some additional material, but all relates to your theme. You know what they say? If your premises in a syllogism are right, the conclusion will always be right. But if your premises are wrong, then your conclusion's not as strong. It won't be true necessarily. Spot is a dog. All dogs have 4 legs. Therefore, Spot has 4 legs. The only problem is not all dogs have 4 legs. You got a weak premise, and therefore the conclusion not as good. But if you get true premises, your conclusion will. And again, you don't have to explain math or any of that to these people. They'll just know it's true. You know it's true. You know it. You tell. You got to build that into your thinking. And when you're making these biblical arguments, make them strong. True points, true premises, and then tell them, I've got this and this and this, and now this. And those transition thoughts help you to go from one point to another point. Now that we know who the Lord is, I want to talk to you about him being my Lord. And then you do it. And then you say, this Lord who is mine is my shepherd. And that's what this, and you tell them about that. But you see, they can see clear cut. Bible outlines are everywhere. There's what's that? Jesus came, Jesus went, and Jesus coming again. Isn't that a beautiful truth? Now that's pretty broad, and everybody knows that, but it fits. You know that's true, and people like to hear truths. They know. I mean, goodness, you all like to hear your wife tell you she loves you. So tell people the truth. Preach the word. It's a beautiful thing about the scriptures when you do it and you do it freshly. people can never get tired of it. It's precious, sweet, good. So we're talking here about the importance of major points. And in the third major point is normally a conclusion. It's based upon the argument you've made in the first 2 points. It's drawing, it's like a cast net. You cast it out there. It's all a big circle. And it goes on top of the water and it starts sinking down. And you pull the drawstring. And every little shiner or every little crawfish or what was in there, he gets caught because you're pulling the net around him. That's like what the preaching's doing. You're casting the net of the Word of God, and then you're drawing the conclusion. This is where people get in the net. This is where they get to be a part of and see themselves as a part of, and that has to happen here in this section of your sermon. So, again, you tie it together. So, an introduction. And then 2, 3 major points. And now it's time to end. The part that it's easy to go right through. Preach your sermon again. When you've said it, shut up. Don't just keep, what do they say? If you can't strike all in 30 minutes, quit boring. Stop. Sometimes the best part of the sermon is to stop. The conclusion, what about it? It too, 3, 4 minutes, somewhere right along in there. That's going to depend on how long you spend on your major points. You have to compensate along the way. And it's hard to do that on the fly, isn't it? When you're preaching. So you just do it in your notes. But when you're up there actually in front of everybody, especially if you don't have a written manuscript, you're preaching from notes. You can run through those stop signs in a big time hurry. I'll tell you can. So, the conclusion, you got to have in the back of your mind, remember, keep an eye on yourself, that, okay, and I also have a clock. I don't like clocks in the front of the church where everybody's watching the clock, you know. But I have one on the pulpit. I guarantee you I have one for me. It's not for them, it's for me. And I watch that dude. And I can tell usually where I am. And you don't watch it at the last 5 minutes only. You need to start watching your clock about the first 5 minutes, not just the last, and see where you are. I sometimes I'm half through. I look at that clock and see if I got 15 more minutes. I know that's about it. So, conclusion. Well, it should relate back to the proposition and the theme. Okay, I told you that I was going to do this, and here's what I've done, and now here's what it means to you. This is the so what part of the sermon right here. So, okay, preacher, you did all that lofty talk. Was that so what? What does it mean to me? Right here is the so what. It's where you draw it together. Summary review. Systematically touch main points and theme. This edifies the mind. You go back and touch major point 1, major point 2, major point 3. You don't elaborate and preach it again. You just touch it. Number B is the application. So, okay, this is what you told me. How does it apply? How does it fit me? Well, this is where it motivates the soul. Spirit, soul, and body, you're talking about motivating or edifying the mind and motivating the soul. And then as a part of this conclusion is the direction. What does it mean? This, again, the so what part, which is part, this activates the will. So that people want to go out of here and do different. This is not a sterile sermon. It's touched them. It's moved them. They heard from God. And you were just the conduit, just the messenger. So when you've delivered the message, stop. And don't ruin the message by meandering and going on some more and preaching it again.